All right, so a reflection flips a figure across a line to create a mirror image. All right, so a reflection here, reflection flips the figure across a line. This is called the line of reflection to create a mirror image here. So, depending on whether you flip it in the coordinate plane across the x-axis or if you flip it across the y-axis, here is the rule. And it makes sense, right? Because if we draw it, I'm going to draw a little coordinate plane right here. And let's say we have this point, right, which is, I'm going to call it 1, 2, and then up 1, 2, 3. So this is my point. It's 2, 3. And if I was to reflect this across the x-axis, right, it's 3 units away. So that means it's going to be 3 units away over here. And it would be right here. So if you look at it, the x is still 2. It's just the y that becomes negative. Do you see that? So this is a reflection. This point reflects across this x-axis. So that's why the reflection across the x-axis says you start with a point and then you keep the same x, right? X is still 2, but what happens to the y? The y is positive and here it becomes negative. And that's the rule. The y is positive and then it becomes negative. That's the rule for a reflection across the x-axis. Okay, now let's talk about what happens when it reflects across the y-axis, right? This is the y-axis. So right now, how far is this point away from the y-axis? It's 1, 2. So that means it would reflect 1, 2 on this side. And then the point would end up being, what, -2, but it is still 3. So what changed? The x, which was 2, is now negative. That's why down here with the rule, the x then for the reflection across the y-axis, it becomes negative. But you see the y is the same. It's 3 here and it's also 3 here. So the y remains the same in the rule. Okay, so these are 2 rules for when something gets reflected across the x-axis and when something, you do this, x negative y, and when something gets reflected across the y-axis, you do this rule, negative x, y. Okay, let's go ahead and do a couple examples. So this is A. So this says graph the quadrilateral ABCD across the x-axis. So this is what we're starting with, and we're going to reflect it across the x-axis. So when we're reflecting across the x-axis, right, it's going to be this rule. So xy is what I start with, and then it's going to go to x negative y. And that makes sense, right? Because this is the reflection where the x is the same, it's just that y where it's positive and then it becomes negative. So we're just going to do that for each of these 4 points. So here A, I'm going to start with A. A is 0, 0. And then I'm going to do this rule, which is going to make it A prime, right, where the x is the same, but then the y becomes -0, which is just 0, 0. So nothing really changed here. Okay, so this is my A prime. It stayed the same. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's go to B. Oops, sorry about that. Kind of got shaky for a second. Okay, so B is 1. What's the ordered pair? It's 1, 2. And we're going to go to B prime. So we're going to reflect it across the x-axis. So we're going to do this rule. The x stays the same. So right now x is 1. But the y becomes negative, so it's -2. So that's our B prime. So 1, -2. Perfect. Okay, then let's do C. So the order pair for C is 1, 2, 3, 4, up 2. 4, 2, and we're going to reflect it. It's going to be C prime once we do that reflection transformation. And the x remains the same. And then the y becomes -2. So there's our C prime. 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, down 2. C prime. And lastly, D. D is 1, 2, 3, 0. And we're going to go, oops, sorry about that. We're going to go to D prime, where the x remains the same. Oh my gosh, sorry, I keep bumping it. And then the y becomes negative, and at 0, negative 0 is just 0. So really, BD prime just stays in the same spot. So I'm going to make my little quadrilateral here. And there we go. This is what we started with, and then it gets reflected across the x-axis. All right. So you write the rule, you do all the work, you graph it. Boom. That's how these problems work. Okay, on to problem B. Okay, so this one says, graph the quadrilateral ABCD across the y-axis, right? This is the y-axis, so we're going to reflect it over there. So let's go ahead and look at that rule again. So the y-axis, remember we had this point, we reflected across the y-axis, the x part changes and the y stays the same. So here's our rule. xy goes to negative xy. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and write that rule down for the reflection across the y-axis. xy goes to negative xy. And then we're just going to apply that to each of the 4 vertices. So let's start with A. A should be pretty easy just because it's the origin. 0, 0, and I doubt anything's going to change. So we have negative x, or negative 0, which is just 0. And then y is the same. Oh, I meant to write A prime. Whoops. Okay, so here we have A prime right here. Goodness gracious, I'm having a hard time writing right now. I don't know if my friend will work that well. Hey, it worked perfectly. What a good friend. Okay, so A prime. Perfect. Okay, let's go on to B. So B is right here, and it is the point 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. And that's going to go to B prime, where the x becomes negative, so it becomes negative 1, and the y is the same. It's 2. So negative 1, 2, that ends up being B prime. Okay, now on to C. C is 1, 2, 3, 4, up 2. And that's going to go and become C prime, where the x becomes negative, and the y stays the same. Then we're just going to graph that. So negative 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and up 2. Here is the C prime. And then lastly, D. And D is 1, 2, 3, 0. And that's going to become D prime, where the x becomes negative, and the y stays the same at 0. So negative 3, 0 will be 1, 2, 3. And this is our D prime. And now I'm just going to go ahead and connect all these dots and get my lovely quadrilateral. And boom, there we have it. There's our figure reflected across the y-axis. And this is the line of reflection. All right, perfect. I will see you next time. Well, in a little bit for example 3.